While we've not ruled out an abduction, we simply do not have any evidence at this point to confirm that's what occurred.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That was Leslie Earhart in an earlier press conference, and I think it just cast everything that is going on now into perspective. This talk of an abduction, even an authoritative channel talking about an abduction, but the authorities themselves not convinced of it. And of course, that's the position of this channel as well. Now, in this episode, we're going to deal with some more of the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to go through 7 more slips in the Sermon on the Mount, which is essentially the second part to the first episode that I did. So essentially this episode deals with around about after the 2-minute mark, which is where the first episode got to, and it again only deals with the next 2 minutes of the Sermon on the Mount. Once again, I will be playing you audio excerpts and then interrogating them, commenting on them, getting a sense of context and what one can draw out of that through things like statement analysis, right? Just before we get started with the episode, I also want to let you know that I'm going to be following up the previous video dealing with that church vigil with a couple of additional photos and also commentary on that whole aspect. So I'm going to go into that into more detail. And then I also want to go into another area which I don't think people have really touched on, substance abuse, but in a particular area beyond the current discussions that are going on. In any event, before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I'm not really going to go into Candace or Don's comments about Summer's short hair, which is how the second minute, the sort of area in the extended version, obviously I'll provide a link to that once again in the description. That is how it kicks off. From about the second minute, it deals with Don and Candace talking about Summer's short hair. And as far as I'm concerned, that has been fairly overblown. What I am going to say is that I think Candace seems quite indignant about this. She's a lot less indignant or emotional when she describes the abduction right in the beginning, or what happened to her sister nearer the end. So one has the sense that Candace does feel a sense of opprobrium towards what must feel like, and surely must be, an often unkind, disapproving world. Does that make sense? Her Facebook posts also seem to reinforce the sense of being slighted over things we might consider small. I do think Don reveals something, not so much in his response to the shaved hair story, but in his choice of words. It's also interesting that to make his point, he interrupts Candace. So let's go to that now.
I think you can see it in some of the pictures, and it was getting out of control.
So slip number 1 is out of control. Don says, I think you can see it in some of the pictures, and it was getting out of control. Now, obviously, he's talking about Summer's hair, of course, right? I wonder whether he's not leaking something through that unusual choice of words. It was getting out of control. You can see it in the pictures. Now, think about those words and the fabric of drugs, abuse, neglect, criminality, and overall dysfunction dogging this case. It was getting out of control. You can see it in the pictures. Well, can you? I do think you can see in some of their pictures other things getting out of control repeatedly. You could say the population of the dogs was getting out of control. And isn't that the issue here, that things were getting out of control in the run-up to the incident with Summer and then the disappearance that followed the incident? So isn't that the real question here? Were things getting out of control? How were they? Were things under control at the swimming hole? What about afterwards? And what about Don and Candace's response to the media and social media. The social media response, what has their response been to social media? A lot of that, which continues into right now, I think is about trying to keep things under control. Do you think they're succeeding?
So we decided to shave her head off and let it grow back.
So that brings us to slip number 2. Who shaved her head? Did Summer shave her own head? And if you take Don's words, he says, so she interrupts himself and then says, we decided to shave her head. In other words, he corrects from she decided to shave her head to we decided to shave her head. And then she shaved her head. She shaved her head so she wouldn't feel bad, but it didn't bother her, right? This statement is just all over the place. And again, I don't think it matters really what happened there so much. Maybe it does. But I think the problem is kind of what this points towards, not so much what it is, right? One gets a sense that Don is trying to avoid stepping into potholes while he's speaking. I mean, who shaved Summer? And if she wasn't bothered, why did she shave her head in the first place? I don't think it's hugely significant, except that if there are these niggles over insignificant disclosures when there don't need to be, what sort of problems are there about the big things, like the timeline and the sleeping arrangements and the substances and what happened on June the 15th?
Well, I knew right away that she was abducted.
And so exactly what I've spoken about in the previous point comes up in slip number 3, where Don says, we knew immediately. He said, I knew right away that she was abducted, and that's what I told them from the beginning, right? I wonder whether that's what he told Candace from the beginning, that's what he thought, which would make it automatically what she thought. So I don't know what Don told the cops. They would know, but in the beginning, that is what he told the media. In his first interviews on Thursday, June 17th, 2 days after Summer's disappearance, Don didn't use the word abductor, but he did talk about someone sneaking around. And so this is a quote from June 17th. He said, we know that there's people praying all around the world, praying for her safe return. So many people love her. She would never leave our hill. I think that someone snuck up on her and grabbed her. I don't think she's in the area because the dog goes down to the road and that's the end of the trail, but I don't know that for a fact. The way that she just disappeared, she would never do that, end quote. And yet the authorities seem less sure. That is why I played you the clip right in the beginning. Why is it an abduction at the exclusion of literally everything else? Why can't she have wandered off or gotten lost or been picked up by a family member or simply fell somewhere in the woods? Why can't there have been an accident or an animal? But more particularly, when Don says we knew, isn't that the narrative him and Candace have sort of supported of late? I mean, they didn't know immediately, but now they're saying they both knew immediately. Did Candace know immediately? Well, if she did know immediately, did she say so? And why did she remain silent for 2 weeks following Summer's disappearance? So one wonders, was it someone's idea to say that this was an abduction? And if so, whose idea was it to say that?
I'm sorry that they had to spend so many man hours in these woods and everything. I've seen them limping and...
Now, just to show the mind works and how the route that the mind is going tends to trigger other thoughts and other ideas. If you go to the original interview, at around about 3 minutes, Don is talking about the steps the police have to make. And when he says the word steps, that leads him into the area of people literally taking steps, in other words, walking. And then he says he feels bad about the man hours that are sort of being, I guess, wasted, or just the sheer amount of resources that are being brought to bear in the search for Summer. So when he says, I'm so sorry they had to spend so many man hours in these woods, is he? Are you sorry? Because in the Chris Watts case, in the middle of complimenting the cops for being on point and casually allowing the dogs to search his home, he seemed to be trying to hide a smile because there's nothing, nobody, and it was like a ghost town. And he knew that. And he seemed to take a kind of a pleasure in that, right? We also know now that Watts spent Monday night cleaning and moving things around. So of course the cops weren't really going to find much. But if you recall, they didn't find nothing. In the Wells case, one wonders whether Summer is in the woods or in some watercourse in the woods or some cave in the woods or some building, perhaps under construction in the woods. I think the answer to that lies in looking at Don's expertise. What does he do every day? Could where Summer is have something to do with drywalling or finishing?
There's just no way you can search every single house, in the eastern United States or.
And that's slip number 5, where Don says there's just no way you can search every single house. The weirdness factor in this statement is just bizarre. Why must neighbors search neighbors' houses? In other words, why should my neighbor search my house instead of me? Or why should I search my neighbor's house? What that may reveal is the idea of someone being in a neighbor's house, but bearing in mind Don's job as a finisher is that he has access to all sorts of houses, all sorts of neighbors, and who knows, perhaps neighboring properties too. In the same way that Chris Watts seemed quite chuffed with himself during the sermon on the porch, only to feel ashamed and humiliated when he admitted where his family, especially his kids, really were. And there was this thought of, well, we need to get them out of there, and do you mind if we call up some of your colleagues? Maybe they can help us out. He was appalled. He was horrified at that idea. But it started off with him actually being seemingly quite pleased with himself, quite almost confident and smug, right? Standing on the porch, where he had one up on the authorities and the media and everyone else, where only he knew where they were. And I think he's quite confident that no one else knew or could find out unless he told them. And something like that did play out. I mean, no one, I think, would have guessed where the children were. And if he'd never said where the children were, I'm not sure whether they would really have been found, because I just don't think anyone would have thought to think to search in those oil tanks. So one wonders whether there's a sense here that is similar of Don possibly luxuriating in the impossible scale and scope of the search. Does he seem torn up or upset or anguished or worried because the searchers are limping and the search is limited, and there's a sort of a sense that they're not succeeding? Is there a sense of despair about that, or can you see something else? Is he perhaps feeling something else about that? Now, I think what is quite interesting there is also, and I'm going to match it up so that you can see what I'm talking about. Don says there's just no way you can search every single house in the eastern United States. Now why throw that in? Why make what's already a very difficult search in that area absolutely impossible, turning it into, okay, we're going to search the entire eastern United States? Is that necessary? I mean, why do searchers have to search on the scale of the entire eastern United States? So when Don says this, it actually reminds me of Watts saying something similar. So I'm going to play exactly what Don has said and then juxtapose that with what Chris Watts said in the sermon on the porch. Okay, here we go.
There's no way you can search every single house, in the eastern United States or.
I mean, Colorado is, you can't just drive around and look. It's just like you wouldn't really know what you're looking for. That's what the cops pretty much told me. That first day I was like, I want to get out and drive around. They said, you won't know what to look for.
So once again, to test out what we're talking about here, how do you think Chris Watts felt about that? That people wouldn't know what to look for, and the apparently hopeless, fruitless scale of it all, right? How do you think he felt standing on the porch, knowing what we know now, when he said that? And let me just repeat what he said. He said, I mean, Colorado is, you can't just drive around and look. I mean, it's just like you wouldn't really know what you're looking for. That's what the cops pretty much told that first day. I want to get out and drive around. They said you wouldn't know what to look for. And so obviously we know where Shanann and the children were. We know where in Colorado they were. We also know that had everyone gone searching, they wouldn't have found them anywhere in that neighborhood, right? They wouldn't have found them anywhere in Frederick. They wouldn't have found them anywhere close to Frederick. And even had they gone to search some of the work sites, it would have been quite a mission to try and find anything there. At face value, they would have just seen, well, there's nothing. It's kind of like just bare terrain and oil tanks. There's nothing there, right? And of course, it was just below the surface, a couple of inches below the surface of the soil, something was hidden. Inside those 2 oil tanks, we know what the situation was. And so what he's giving away here, what Chris Watts was giving away here, was intimate knowledge that's sort of leaking out because it's at the top of his mind. He's thinking about they can't just drive around and look. And he's also kind of grateful that the cops kind of gave him the way out to say, you know what, you won't know what to look for. But isn't that also how he feels? We wouldn't have known what to look for, right? In other words, an excuse is made that acknowledges the hopelessness and fruitlessness of searching, but the resignation and lack of effect and certainty is inappropriate because there should be urgency in the face of uncertainty and hope in the face of obvious despair. And one's got to bear that in mind when we look at Don saying those words. Is there urgency in the face of uncertainty, or is there resignation? Is there hope in the face of obvious despair, or is there resignation? Now, obviously, when they come into contact with the church flock kind of really demonstrate what authentic emotions are going to look like amongst innocent people, which is to be hopeful, to be praying, that also believing that some are still alive. And of course, we've heard all of the opposite coming from Don and Candace. One also has to wonder what Don knows and if there's any similarity to the sermon that we saw with Watts knowing exactly where searchers needed to look. Don also seems to suggest the police need to look somewhere where the police still need a warrant. I think that is definitely quite interesting. He talks about, it's going to be very hard for the police and neighbors don't want to cooperate. They're going to need to get a warrant. And I think one possible way to hypothetically trim down the scale and scope in terms of all the possibilities is to consider a situation where you would need a warrant in order to search. And what that suggests to me is it's some kind of private property, so in other words, not necessarily wilderness. I could be wrong, but that does seem to be what that could be suggesting. And that brings us to slip number 6.
She's an awesome young lady. And
so slip number 6 is a kind of creepy, she's an awesome young lady. This slip crops up at about 3 minutes 40 seconds into the Sermon on the Mount. Don seems to be saying they want Summer back because she's an awesome young lady. Not because he's their daughter or she's their daughter and they miss her. And in this context, we've got to bear in mind, again, the sleeping arrangement. At 5 years old, Summer was far from a young lady. She wasn't even a teen.
we just want to focus on the good friends and Christian people that are trying to help us and praying.
So that's slip number 7. Don doesn't want to focus on the haters, except he has been. Many of his social media posts are to express displeasure, grievances, and gripes with those he disagrees with or who disagree with him. Is it fair to say his focus has been divided or even diverted to these tantrums against trolls and betrayers rather than on Summer herself? Have Candace and Don ever been seen actually searching for Summer themselves? Do they call the cops with questions, or do they invariably wait passively and respond to the occasional questions from the cops as and when they materialize? What did Chris Watts do in that regard? We actually know the answer to that question. What did the Ramseys do? How about the McCanns? Now, in yesterday's video, I put up a post about Candace shedding a tear. And I think, if you want to know, how are they cooperating and what is the interaction like with law enforcement, I think one gets perhaps an echo of that, an analogy to that, when you see them at these prayer vigils. How proactive are they? How activated are they? What are they raising their voice about? What are they saying? What are they doing? And the answer seems to be that they seem to be doing exactly what I mentioned earlier, waiting passively, responding only when someone sort of addresses them. They're sort of making an appearance, and it's sort of, as far as I'm concerned, it seems to be done for appearances, and it is gaining some traction. I would argue not very much, but better than nothing, I guess, from their perspective. What I also think is quite interesting is, in my video that I put up yesterday about Candace shedding a tear, I noted quite explicitly in that video that that is what people want to see. In situations like this, in cases like this, people want to know that the mother cares about her daughter and is emotional, and it's quite interesting to juxtapose the emotions of the people beside Candace with Candace herself. Look how emotional they're getting. Look how activated they're getting. Look at what they are saying. And they are sort of innocent bystanders. They are people who are sort of getting caught up in everything. Why is the person at the center of it not? So a few hours after I put up the video, Candace and Don pitched up to a prayer vigil, and then there Candace appeared emotional. One could argue almost more emotional than we've ever seen her, that she looked sad, and she appeared to shed another tear on Timmy Etherton's camera. So could it be that they're watching social media and adapting their game accordingly? What do you guys think? You also see in the video Candace brushing away a tear, kind of dabbing her fingers into her eye and sort of brushing away a tear on camera. 50 days later, Candace is grieving. That seems to be the message. In the McCann case, Madeline's mother was first criticized for not being very emotional. And then after a certain period of time, after this was reported in the news a couple of times, after people started talking about it, only after that, then Kate did appear more emotional, right? In November 2007, they explained their lack of emotion was because they were warned by the police not to be emotional. So actually have the McCanns almost making it official, saying, yes, we were unemotional, but the reason we were doing it was actually very intelligent. It was a strategy. The police told us not to be emotional, and so we weren't, right? We didn't want to kind of trigger or influence the abductor. We might be getting his kicks out of the whole thing. But the problem is that they ended up being pretty convincing if they were acting that they were unemotional. It was a damn convincing act of being unemotional. It was pretty impressive, just the length of time where you don't see anyone shedding a single tear. And then, of course, you see other emotions despite being ordered not to be emotional by the cops, you sometimes saw them laughing. So they were then emotional again. So were you allowed to laugh, sort of be happy and perhaps nonchalant, but you can't be unhappy under the circumstances? Strange, isn't it? In any event, that's 7 more insights from the Sermon on the Mount taken from the next 2 minutes. I do think the Sermon on the Porch juxtaposes quite nicely in many of these areas. Now, in part 3, we'll deal with the interview from the 4-minute mark onwards. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.